Well, welcome back, amazing students, and thank you for joining me for part 2 of our lecture on substance dependency as it pertains to lifespan development. And so, as promised, I wanted to make sure that the material that you're receiving in this course is current, that it's up to date, that it is addressing um, issues that not only have impacted us historically, but are really setting the trend for where future practices, considerations, potentially even social problems can manifest themselves in the coming years. Life is very unique now across the nation and within our state, within the state of California, in that you are living in a time where in the 60s and 70s, people thought we may not ever see, where cannabis and the legalization in particular of marijuana is now legal in a number of states and available both for medical as well as recreational use. And for that reason, I think that there's some important complications and important implications really to consider, right? Um, my goal with this lecture is not to create a argument for or against the legalization of cannabis. Um, we've seen the legalization of cannabis, that voters have spoken in terms of a desire for legalization within the states. We'll talk about the federal implications for that too in this lesson. But what I want us to be able to discuss is anything in life, all choices in life have consequences, right? All of them, positive and negative, right? You choose to, if you make a choice to work out every day, to diet, to exercise, a consequence of that, at least we're certainly hoping for, is increased health, right? I seem to make some of those choices. I don't know if I benefit as much as I wish I would, but regardless, right? You make a choice and you have a consequence. We have lots of choices before us in regards to substances as human beings, right? Here in California, I mean, you can purchase alcohol 24/7 at a supermarket, right, without any restrictions other than your age. Whereas in other parts of the country, there are dry towns, dry counties, certain places in the country where you can only buy certain alcohol at certain times of the day, up till even 9 o'clock at night, and then everything's tarped off, right? So here in California, you have access to alcohol. Here in California, you have access to tobacco, right, and nicotine. Here in California, you can choose now to purchase marijuana or cannabis, as I'll refer to it in this lesson. All right, legally for recreation and for medicinal use. So the goal today, as I was saying, is not to create an argument, an us and them sort of discussion. Is really just talk about now. Legalization is here at the state level. What are some of the implications or discussions that we should at least begin to inquire more of, right, related to this particular topic? So let's start with a little bit of history of, very brief, and then where we find ourselves today regarding cannabis legalization here in California. Again, laws vary state by state. Some states have not moved forward with legalization, others have, but to certain degrees. So we're talking about California as it relates to today's lesson. Cannabis is legal in California, as you know, for medical use. We were actually the first state in the union to legalize medical marijuana in 1996, and became recreational in 2018. Okay, ages for medical use is over the age of 18 to obtain a recommendation alone. You can obtain a recommendation under the age of 18 with parental or guardian consent. Age of 21 is the minimum age for recreational use of cannabis to purchase here in California. Now, what's important to note is I stated that I had already sort of alluded to that state law is not the same as federal law, that because the state of California says that cannabis is legal for recreational and medical use does not mean that it's 100% legal in the United States. Some of you may have already known that. Some of you, this may be the first time hearing it, which is fine. That's why we're doing this lesson, right? So there's state and federal law. What the states choose to place as their law is still subject to federal enforcement if the two laws do not complement one another or are not aligned. Okay, and in this case, we have a misalignment between state and federal law regarding cannabis, not only in California, but any other state that's chosen to legalize it. So, for example, California, the state says you may purchase marijuana for these categories, these reasons, ages, and all that. And here are the legalities around that of pursuing licensure. Here are the counties that allow it, all these kind of things, right? The structure. Federal law still states that cannabis is not approved as a legal substance here in the United States. So what I thought I would do is highlight exactly what the law states from the DEA, okay, regarding Schedule 1 drugs, in particular cannabis. And so let's examine this for a second. It's important to note first, okay, that here it says that a Schedule 1 substance, all right, is subject to criminal prosecution, right? A controlled substance is a substance in which is intended for humans' consumption and is structurally or pharmacologically, I'm sorry, I'm running into some tongue twisters today, substantially similar to or is represented as being similar to a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substance. It's not an approved medication in the United States, okay? And so under the Schedule 1 category of substances here in the United States, we have categorized several substances in addition to marijuana, okay, as a Schedule 1 drug. And what that means is it is not approved in the United States for medication in the United States. So even though the state of California since 1996 has stated that it is acceptable to utilize marijuana as a treatment, all right, the federal government has said otherwise. As a result of that, the federal government can choose to prosecute individuals for usage of marijuana in California if it was so inclined of the federal government to do so, even though the law in California says that you can. Okay, so that's why I said that state law is subject to federal law. Now, Schedule 1 drugs, under the definition of the DEA, okay, fall under substances or chemicals, are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. So notice that there. So some examples of Schedule 1 drugs include substances like heroin, right? LSD. Here's marijuana as listed in there. Ecstasy, peyote, other substances such as this. Now, it's important to also note that if the federal government labels a substance as a Schedule 1 class drug and it has stated that there's no medical benefit to it, that also means that there are no funds at the federal level dedicated to studying the medical benefits of cannabis, and therefore not backed by a whole lot of research in this country in regards to the benefits of marijuana and cannabis, certainly not on a clinical scale. So it's also important to understand that a lot of folks have generated discussion and conversation around the benefits of THC, the benefits of CBD, both active ingredients in cannabis, both which claim to have different effects, psychoactive effects, as well as other effects for neurological disorders, inflammation, pain, depression, all of these things. Some of that is rooted in research that may have been conducted overseas. But it's important to understand with research, right? A large body of research is necessary in order to determine, in fact, if there's clinical relevance to some of these claims. So the research that we're already applying that shapes our mindset of our perception of cannabis in general is skewed. And so I want to just sort of throw that out there right off the bat. Now, while we're looking, okay, the DEA categorizes Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4 class drugs, okay? And those categories depend on what sort of charges might be brought forward, as well as sentencing related to violation of these federal drug categories, possession, intent to sell, all of these kind of abuse of these drugs. So let's look at what constitutes a Schedule 4 class drug under the DEA. Schedule 4 drugs include substances with a low potential for abuse and low risk of dependence. Some examples of Schedule 4 drugs are Xanax, Soma, right? Look at this, Darvin, Darvocet, Valium, Ativan, Tauin, Ambien, right? And Tramadol. So some of you might be saying, wow, Xanax and Soma and Ambien, right? Low potential for abuse and low risk of dependence. We certainly have seen that's not the case statistically, right? With some of these drugs, high potential still exists. And so some of you may ask the question, how is it that cannabis was categorized as a Schedule 1 here, right? And Schedule 4, we've got Xanax and Ambien on this list. How they make the list? And that's a highly contentious subject, right? One that we won't dive into for the purpose of this lesson, nor do we have the time to cover this in its entirety, right? There's several schools of thought here. One school of thought is that there was a institutional bias placed on cannabis during one in particular, war on drugs, one in particular on how cannabis and its perception of usage and those that used it, that bias towards those individuals led it to being categorized as a Schedule 1, as well as those who are sort of labeled as users of Xanax, Ambien, and all of these other substances aren't subject to the same institutional bias. Other people said it's a matter of when these drugs, these categories were made. And obviously, individuals who are pro-legalization will state that marijuana, cannabis in particular, should be decategorized and moved from a Schedule 1 to a lower schedule, okay, even a 4, if you will, in order to allow not only for usage, okay, for medical benefits, but also for research to be conducted on cannabis in particular. So again, some of the discussions going on related to substances, particularly cannabis legalization. Now, what I would like to do is in the next slide, I'd like to show you a video. In this video, you're going to hear from an individual who offers his opinion on the discussion surrounding the legalization of cannabis within our country. Now, it's important to understand, some of you may ask the question, so Dr. Meiko, you're going to present a video, a TED Talk, all right, discussing what are really some of the implications and quite honestly, what are some of the potential risks, okay, of legalizing cannabis in our country. If you notice, some of the concerns that the speaker addresses not only come from this, is marijuana good or bad, which oftentimes is the platform for many of our discussions around cannabis legalization. What I enjoyed about this particular TED Talk was also the fact that this particular speaker considered some sociological implications, even social justice issues related to the legalization of cannabis. And so we've all heard generally many of the arguments on why we should legalize, right? The same generic talking points of it is medically valid. There are some amazing benefits to cannabis. You've heard folks say it's not as bad as alcohol. You've heard folks say it's really not a gateway drug. We know that it's separate from that. You've heard other folks say, well, there's no point in criminalizing it because so many people use it, and all of those discussions, right? What's often missing from the conversation are exactly some of the points that our speaker discusses here. So again, not to land on pro or con, but to give you some additional information to really begin to think about this discussion within our country critically. And then I'm going to share with you some additional considerations outside of this TED Talk, okay? So what we'll do is go ahead and jump onto the next slide to watch the video, the TED Talk. I'll share a few brief thoughts towards the end of the TED Talk. Okay, what I enjoyed about this particular TED Talk is the perspective, right, that is brought into our discussion on legalization and the commercialization of cannabis. And so, as I stated in the previous slide, matters regarding environmental sort of impact. And I'm not talking about only environment in terms of, water and the earth and its resources. And I'm talking about what is the sociological impact to society when we move through the commercialization of a substance that we have not fully researched, that we know is tied to higher levels of depression, suicidality, and substance dependency in general. What are the sort of thoughts that we are having regarding potential lines to be crossed between marketing, what we've done historically, as he stated, regarding food and tobacco, vaping even, right, and what we're doing regarding cannabis. That everything that is being put in front of us is not representative of all that should be involved in our discussion. And when we accept simply the narrative that marketers put in front of us, we run the danger of being misinformed, right? And then when we are misinformed, we are misguided in our decision making, and then at times we make some poor decisions. So again, an interesting perspective to bring to the discussion regarding legalization. So let's go ahead and move forward in our discussion, and I'll give you some other points and thoughts to consider regarding this discussion.
Hey, look, if you guys are anything like me, you have found it harder and harder to turn around recently without seeing words like free range, farm to table, organically produced, especially here in Colorado. Now, as we've become more conscientious of the way that we eat in recent years, these once unfamiliar words have worked their way into our daily lexicon. When we started to pay more attention to the way that the food we were eating interacted with our bodies and with the earth, the food industry had to listen. And the results have been really powerful. Words like all natural and homegrown are not just being used in our diets. There's this whole new industry using this language now. Now, those of you out there from states like Washington and Oregon, and of course, my fellow Coloradans, y'all know what I'm talking about. It's weed. An industry that taxed a sale of about $6 billion worth of product in 2016. So what if I were to propose to you that some of what you think you know about this legalized marijuana thing could be wrong? Listen, I get it. Talking about issues with legal weed is a pretty quick way to get uninvited from the cool kids table. I know that better than most, but I intend to do it anyway. First, before I get started, let me be perfectly clear about one thing. My fight is not against the casual adult use of marijuana. I don't care about that. What I care deeply about is this new industry that is working to convince us that we are consuming something natural while fixing social ills when we aren't. So let's start with a little bit of Weed 101. Cannabis is a plant that grows naturally and has been used within textiles and even traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. Genesis 1:12 even tells us that I have given you all of the seed-bearing plants and herbs to use. It's the microphone. It's got a TV preacher sort of thing. Now, cannabis is made up of hundreds of different chemicals, but two of those chemicals are by far the most interesting. That's CBD and THC. So CBD is where almost all of the medicinal properties lie. It's an incredibly fascinating part of the plant with real potential to help people. It also is totally non-intoxicating. You could take a bath in the stuff while vaping pure CBD and drinking a CBD smoothie, and you still couldn't get high. I've tried. I haven't. That cost a lot of money. Now, for as interesting and remarkable a part of the plant as CBD is, it actually makes up a really tiny portion of the commercial market. The real money is being made in that other chemical, in THC. So THC is the natural part of the plant that gets you high. And before the 1970s, cannabis contained less than 0.5% of THC. That's what's naturally occurring. Over the last 40 years, as we became better gardeners, that percentage of THC started to slowly but steadily rise. Until recently, when the chemists started to get involved. These guys moved cultivation exclusively indoors, and they made grow cycles extremely and unnaturally short. They also started to use pesticides and fertilizers in some ways that we should be concerned with. In fact, I was recently talking to a buddy who had just left a job at a commercial grow operation because he was so concerned with the chemicals that he was being asked to interact with. Some of his fellow employees were actually encouraged to wear hazmat suits while they were spraying their chemical cocktails on the plants. With that kind of manipulation, the products that are being sold today can contain above 30% THC. And our concentrates can actually contain above 95% THC, a far cry from the natural plant. Listen, this isn't your grandpa's weed. This isn't your dad's weed. Like this isn't even my weed. If you've ever set foot inside one of the thousands of dispensaries that have sprung up in recent years, you know that what we're really selling in them is THC. All of the weed that you buy commercially lists exactly how much THC it contains, as do our other much more popular products like vape pens, coffee, ice cream, condiments, granola, gum, candy, baked goods, suppositories, and of course, lube. Pretty much, no, for real. Pretty much anything that you can imagine introducing into the human body. The vast majority of cannabis that's being sold today, it isn't really cannabis. It's THC in either a pure form or in an extremely high and unnatural concentration. To say that we have legalized weed is subtly misleading. We have commercialized THC. And it's happened really quickly. Now, the reason why the commercial market has so rapidly exploded is because there is a hell of a lot of money to be made in satisfying and increasing our desire to get high. And that money's no longer really being made by the mom and pop shops. So industry groups and corporations, groups like the Drug Policy Alliance, the Marijuana Policy Project, ArcView Investment, the Cannabis Industry Association, they've chased out and helped to chase out a lot of the small-time growers. So these cats know that the best way to get us to continue to profit off of us is if they follow the alcohol industry's 80-20 rule. That's simple. It's where 80% of the product is consumed by 20% of the consumers, the problemed users. The wealthy, white weed lobbyists, and seriously, they are almost all rich white men. They know that we will consume more of what they're selling if they jack up the potency. They also know that we are more than twice as likely to consume THC regularly if we earn under $50,000 a year if we earn under $20,000 a year than those who earn over $50,000 a year. In other words, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to spend your money on their products. And in this country, income and race are highly correlated. One of the reasons that we often hear cited for the legalization of marijuana is that it will help to stop the disproportionate incarceration rates among minorities, which is something everybody in this room should be extremely concerned with. Unfortunately, we don't have to look any further than arrest rates for juveniles here in Colorado to counter that argument. According to the Colorado Department of Public Safety, since we opened retail in 2014, almost all of which are in poor minority neighborhoods, we saw an 8% reduction in the arrest of white kids for all weed-related activity. Good on them. During that same time period, There's a 29% increase in the arrest of Hispanic kids for weed-related activity and a 58% increase in the arrest of black kids for weed-related crimes. You guys heard that, right? We are actually arresting more people of color in Colorado than we were prior to commercialization. And you're not reading that in the Post. Another big issue that we have is in school suspension rates. So, schools that are predominantly white, that is, they have a minority population of 25% or fewer. In the first full year of data collection following commercialization, these schools had a grand total of 190 drug-related suspensions, almost all of which are for THC. At the same time, schools with a minority population of 75 to 100% had 801 drug-related suspensions, almost all of which were for THC. When discussing minority populations, one that unfortunately often gets left out of the conversation is the LGBTQ community. Now, members of this community are more than twice as likely to consume THC than those who identify as heterosexual or cisgender. They also, unfortunately, have higher rates of mental illness and suicide. According to a study published in 2014 called Going to Pot, we see that the unnaturally high levels of THC found in today's products, they actually compound those issues and make them worse. Unfortunately, that seems to matter very little to the folks who are selling these products because, as you just saw, clearly this is a good consumer base. Listen, man, I get it. In many circles, legalized marijuana is just too much of a sacred cow to question. But we need to start this conversation because what's being sold today is not natural, and lobbyists in industry are using social justice as a smokescreen so that they can get richer. It's been my own journey to sobriety that led me to begin questioning a lot of what I was seeing. That's kind of one of the things that we're taught to do. When I left Boulder for the Washington, D.C. area at 12 years old, man, I was transported into a world where the kind of shoes that you wore mattered more than just about anything else. And my family was just too poor to help me play that game. So I was faced with a pretty real crisis of identity. In this new scene where there's more blacktop than treetops, man, I just didn't know who I was. So I smoked weed for the first time when I was 13, and I loved it. I instantly found this social group, and I also just really liked being high. Like, I finally found a way to shut this up. I quickly turned to other drugs and alcohol, and something just woke up inside of my brain. I was a daily user within a couple of months. So my addictive use, it mirrors many of the stories that I'm sure you've heard before. It started out as fun, it got scary, and then it was just necessary. Enough said. I got wasted for the last time on June 15th of 1996. And Thank you. And I've spent the last 21 years trying to both put my life back in order as well as trying to find some peace in this world. And one of the ways that I've done that is by working inside of nonprofit drug and alcohol treatment for the last 10 years with groups like Phoenix Multisport, the University of Colorado Hospital, and NowGap, the National Association for Lesbian, Gay, Transgender, Bisexual Treatment Providers and their allies. Even after all of my work on the front lines, and as a former consumer myself, I was shocked and pissed when I started to see what commercialization was doing to cannabis, because you see, our hope for something pure and natural is making it hard for us to see what's really going on. And that is that the rich are getting richer on the backs of the poor and lying to our faces the entire time. Thank you. My friends, once again, I fear that we are allowing industry to take advantage of the most challenged among us in order to turn a profit, much like we saw with tobacco and food in years past. So when we told the food industry that we understood the impact our choices were having and that we demanded better for ourselves and our families, that industry got into line. So is there any reason why we couldn't demand the same thing from this and from future industries who are trying to get a piece of our paychecks? What if we made these guys answer some hard questions? What if we held them to a higher standard than we are right now? Because as it stands, for many in our community, the grass isn't greener on this side of commercialization. They've just been sold a bag of goods. Thank you.
Okay, so let me give you a couple of thoughts, some tidbits of information, of perspective, just to sort of jog your own thought and reflection on this particular topic of cannabis legalization, substance dependency, and its impact across the lifespan. I want to remind us that California law is subject to federal law enforcement, right? So one thing to consider here is, although California may deem it's perfectly legal to purchase, sell, and use cannabis, it's important to understand it is still considered illegal within our country. So there are ramifications to that. Sometimes we walk around with a false impression that just because someone says we can do something, that we should, or that there are no other consequences. But as I was making that argument earlier in the lesson, I want to remind us there's always consequences, right? There's a consequence to every action. Sometimes that consequence is positive, other times it's negative, but we have to be able to weigh our consequences with our actions, right? So another thing to consider is currently, as of this time of recording this lecture, that California labor laws regarding cannabis usage, it's at the discretion of the employer. All right, so an employer can choose to deny hiring an individual if they test positive for cannabis at the time of an interview. Individuals can also be let go right now legally for testing positive regarding cannabis, whether it's legal or not. And so that is because under California state law, we have still yet to pass legislation that would mirror the legalization of cannabis in our state. And so this is a loophole here, and you have to consider, even though I can go out and purchase cannabis, will this result in a job loss should I be tested, right? Or will I miss opportunities in the job market because I am a consumer of cannabis? 4 out of 10 strains, okay, lab tested in California failed to meet the requirements for pesticides and chemical contamination by the state. This is alarming, right? And consistent with the TED Talk stating that it's all organic and it's all healthy and it can't have a negative impact because everything has been grown free, right, of pesticides and chemical contamination. It's important to understand that marketers are looking at the bottom line. They are trying to produce the highest quantity that will yield of cannabis in order to sell that cannabis, that quantity at the highest price. And so if that means that crops need to be protected via pesticides and chemicals in order to avoid little critters, right, from ending up damaging their crops, then they will do that. And as a result, what we've seen here is 40% of the cannabis that makes it onto a shelf failed lab testing. And that's a huge concern for one's health. It is literally not the substance that we thought was being marketed to us. Some other food for thought just relating this topic. Should we, just some questions to reflect on. Should we introduce a new substance when we know we're substance dependent in society in general? We've got an opioid epidemic. We have alcohol ready available. We have a combination of individuals who are using prescription and non-prescription drugs to numb themselves, right, from their experiences in life. Is it wise to add another substance to that menu? We currently use medicine, and I say this to treat illness, to treat illness, and we use it instead to retreat from life? What makes us think cannabis will be any different? Right? When we use substances as a coping mechanism to avoid pain, sorrow, shame, whatever the case is, um, why do we need another one, right? To engage in. We're ingesting genetically altered substances, those crops, right, that are laced with pesticides and chemicals. This isn't, and you always heard this isn't the marijuana that our grandparents smoked, right? This is genetically altered, hybrid methods of growing crops and strains that are potent in nature, yielding a high percentage of THC and or CBD, right? We're only 5 years into the research, maybe 6 at most at this point. We are the biggest, literally, medical experiment in history, right? So what I mean by that is, with legalization going on, the use of CBD and THC and the claims that are being made, people are scooping it up, right? Individuals are smoking it, they're vaping it, they are eating it, right? They are baking it into goods, using it as ointments and infused in waters and all of these things. And we've not researched any of it. We don't know really what the outcome of this usage will be. In fact, you chances are will live the effects of cannabis use when you are just entering or getting ready to advance to the next level of your career. So wherever you're at in your undergrad career at this point, okay, if you are to consume cannabis now, really what's in store for us is, 5 to 10 years down the line, we're going to start to really see the impact of that usage manifest itself in our health, in our relationships, in our mental health, right? And so where are you going to be 5 to 10 years from now? Think about that. Chances are you're going to be in a place where maybe you want to start a family, maybe you want to get married, maybe you're hoping for that career job, right, so that you can buy a house, right, and begin to live your life. Do you want to be potentially just being exposed to some of the consequences of vaping, of edibles, of strains laced with pesticides and chemicals? Again, just something to consider, right? A reality that we need to think about, that oftentimes we don't. Mental illness in particular and substance dependency are the largest disease burdens currently in the United States. These two together make up the largest disease burden in our country. And we know cannabis is addictive and makes mental health issues worse. It actually amplifies depression, anxiety, and all of these things. So if we know that, is this something that we're so sure really is going to benefit us as a society? Okay. So what we're going to do is, in the next slide, I'm going to share with you a video. Okay, this video comes from Brene Brown. As you already know, I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown. And the title of this video is The Power of Vulnerability. At the time when this TED Talk was released, it was the #1 most watched video on YouTube. It was huge. And I would like to share this video with you today. This will be the last solid content. Then I'm going to just close us out with a few thoughts for today's lecture regarding usage. Brene Brown talks about connection and shame and what this does to us as human beings, and how we have, as a culture in the United States, established a culture of substance dependency, of numbing ourselves from the feelings of life. And I would like to end with this, because some of these questions that I asked you here are really getting at the message of this particular TED Talk. Just because we can legalize something, just because we can use something, right? Just because we can purchase it, it doesn't mean that we should. So oftentimes we misconstrue what we legally can do. And we muddle that up with what's right to do. So I'd like for you to dive into this next slide. Enjoy the TED Talk from Brene Brown, and I will close out that slide with just a few very short comments. All right, isn't Brene Brown just amazing? I love this TED Talk. I love all of the aspects of what Brene Brown describes as vulnerability, of this desire to perfect our lives, to also delve into, mask this fear that we have of being vulnerable to one another, the notion of blame, to assign fault to someone, right? And how all of these things that are going on within our hearts, within our minds, make us susceptible, right, to usage in order to prevent all the murky stuff, the messy stuff from happening in life. When in reality, there is never a promise that life will be perfect, right? We are never promised that our lives will be easy. Our lives are what they are. How we respond to them, right, is how we continue to grow as human beings. Human beings, children of God, spiritually and holy, right? And so, I just thought that this is something that's really important for us to consider in this discussion related to cannabis legalization, but also substance dependency across the lifespan. You know, again, we look at substance dependency and individuals battling substance dependency as sometimes being weak. We say that they're emotionally fragile. We say that they've made poor decisions. They don't care about their health, that they don't care about others. In reality, um, we know that substance dependency is far more complex than that. We know that what drives an individual emotionally to utilize substances comes from a very deep place that Brene Brown discussed. And I would just like you to have these thoughts, this content, to allow you to make some of your own critical decisions within your life, and to also understand this notion of substance dependency as it impacts lifespan development a little better.
So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago, an event planner called me because I was going to do a speaking event. And she called and she said, I'm really struggling with how to write about you on the little flyer. And I thought, well, what's the struggle? And she said, well, I saw you speak, and I'm going to call you a researcher, I think, but I'm afraid if I call you a researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant. And I was like, okay. And she said, but the thing I liked about your talk is, you're a storyteller. So I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, you're going to call me a what? And she said, I'm going to call you a storyteller. And I was like, oh, why not Magic Pixie? I was like, let me think about this for a second. And so I tried to call deep on my courage. And I thought, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller? And she went, there's no such thing. So I'm a researcher storyteller. And I'm going to talk to you today. We're talking about expanding perception. And so I want to talk to you and tell some stories about a piece of my research that fundamentally expanded my perception and really actually changed the way that I live and love and work and parent. And this is where my story starts. When I was a young researcher, doctoral student, my first year I had a research professor who said to us, here's the thing, if you cannot measure it, it does not exist. And I thought he was just sweet-talking me. I was like, really? And he's like, absolutely. So you have to understand that I have a bachelor's in social work, a master's in social work, and I was getting my PhD in social work. So my entire academic career was surrounded by people who kind of believed in the life's messy, love it, and I'm more the life's messy, clean it up, organize it, and put it into a bento box. And so to think that I had found my way, to found a career that takes me, really one of the big sayings in social work is lean into the discomfort of the work. And I'm like, knock discomfort upside the head and move it over and get all A's. That was my mantra. So I was very excited about this. And so I thought, you know what? This is the career for me, because I am interested in some messy topics, but I want to be able to make them not messy. I want to understand them. I want to hack into these things that I know are important and lay the code out for everyone to see. So where I started was with connection, because by the time you're a social worker for 10 years, what you realize is that connection is why we're here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. This is what it's all about. It doesn't matter whether you talk to people who work in social justice and mental health and abuse and neglect. What we know is that connection, the ability to feel connected, is neurobiologically, that's how we're wired. It's why we're here. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to start with connection. Well, you know that situation where you get an evaluation from your boss, and she tells you 37 things that you do really awesome and one thing that you can't, an opportunity for growth. And all you can think about is that opportunity for growth, right? Well, apparently this is the way my work went as well, because when you ask people about love, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about belonging, they'll tell you their most excruciating experiences of being excluded. And when you ask people about connection, the stories they told me were about disconnection. So very quickly, really about 6 weeks into this research, I ran into this unnamed thing that absolutely unraveled connection in a way that I didn't understand or had never seen. And so I pulled back out of the research and thought, I need to figure out what this is. And it turned out to be shame. And shame is really easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection? The things I can tell you about it, it's universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you talk about it, the more you have it. What underpinned this shame, this I'm not good enough, which we all know that feeling, I'm not blank enough, I'm not thin enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, smart enough, promoted enough. The thing that underpinned this was excruciating vulnerability. This idea of, in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And you know how I feel about vulnerability. I hate vulnerability. And so I thought, this is my chance to beat it back with my measuring stick. I'm going in, I'm going to figure this stuff out, I'm going to spend a year, I'm going to totally deconstruct shame, I'm going to understand how vulnerability works, and I'm going to outsmart it. So I was ready, and I was really excited. As you know, it's not going to turn out well. You know this. So I could tell you a lot about shame, but I'd have to borrow everyone else's time. But here's what I can tell you that it boils down to. And this may be one of the most important things that I've ever learned in the decade of doing this research. My 1 year has turned into 6 years, thousands of stories, hundreds of long interviews, focus groups. At one point, people were sending me journal pages and sending me their stories, thousands of pieces of data. And 6 years. And I kind of got a handle on it. I kind of understood this is what shame is, this is how it works. I wrote a book, I published a theory, but something was not okay. And what it was is that if I roughly took the people I interviewed and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness, that's what this comes down to, a sense of worthiness. They have a strong sense of love and belonging. And folks who struggle for it, and folks who are always wondering if they're good enough. There was only one variable that separated the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who really struggle for it, and that was the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. They believe they're worthy. And to me, the hard part of the one thing that keeps us out of connection is our fear that we're not worthy of connection, was something that personally and professionally I felt like I needed to understand better. So what I did is I took all of the interviews where I saw worthiness, where I saw people living that way, and just looked at those. What do these people have in common? And I have a slight office supply addiction, but that's another talk. So I had a manila notebook, a manila folder, and I had a Sharpie, and I was like, what am I going to call this research? And the first words that came to my mind were wholehearted. These are kind of wholehearted people living from this deep sense of worthiness. So I wrote at the top of the manila folder, and I started looking at the data. In fact, I did it first in this in a 4-day, very intensive data analysis where I went back, pulled these interviews, pulled the stories, pulled the incidents. What's the theme? What's the pattern? My husband left town with the kids because I always go into this kind of Jackson Pollock crazy thing where I'm just like writing and going and kind of just in my researcher mode. And so here's what I found. What they had in common was a sense of courage. And I want to separate courage and bravery for you for a minute. Courage, the original definition of courage, when it first came into the English language, it's from the Latin word cur, meaning heart. And the original definition was to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. And so these folks had, very simply, the courage to be imperfect. They had the compassion to be kind to themselves first and then to others, because as it turns out, we can't practice compassion with other people if we can't treat ourselves kindly. And the last was they had connection, and this was the hard part, as a result of authenticity. They were willing to let go of who they thought they should be in order to be who they were, which is, you have to absolutely do that for connection. The other thing that they had in common was this. They fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable, nor did they really talk about it being excruciating, as I had heard earlier in the shame interviewing. They just talked about it being necessary. They talked about the willingness to say, I love you first. The willingness to do something where there are no guarantees. The willingness to breathe through waiting for the doctor to call after your mammogram. The willing to invest in a relationship that may or may not work out. They thought this was fundamental. I personally thought it was betrayal. I could not believe I had pledged allegiance to research, where our job, the definition of research is to control and predict, to study phenomenon for the explicit reason to control and predict. And now my mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. This led to a little breakdown, which actually looked more like this. And it did. It led to I call it a breakdown, my therapist calls it a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening sounds better than breakdown, but I assure you it was a breakdown. And I had to put my data away and go find a therapist. Let me tell you something. You know who you are when you call your friends and say, I think I need to see somebody. Do you have any recommendations? Because about 5 of my friends are like, woo, I wouldn't want to be your therapist. And I was like, what does that mean? And they're like, I'm just saying, don't bring your measuring stick. I was like, okay. So I found a therapist. My first meeting with her, Diana, I brought in my list of the way the wholehearted live. And I sat down, and she said, how are you? And I said, I'm great, I'm okay. And she said, what's going on? And I said, and this is a therapist who sees therapists, because we have to go to those because their BS meters are good. And so I said, here's the thing, I'm struggling. And she said, what's the struggle? And I said, well, I have a vulnerability issue, and I know that vulnerability is kind of the core of shame and fear and our struggle for worthiness, but it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love. And I think I have a problem. And I need some help. And I said, but here's the thing. No family stuff, no childhood shit. I just need some strategies. Thank you. So she goes like this. And then I said, it's bad, right? And she said, it's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. And I said, oh my God, this is gonna suck. And it did, and it didn't. And it took about a year. And you know how there are people that, like, when they realize that vulnerability and tenderness are important, that they kind of surrender and walk into it? A, that's not me. And B, I don't even hang out with people like that. For me, it was a year-long street fight. It was a slugfest. Vulnerability pushed, I pushed back. I lost the fight, but probably won my life back. And so then I went back into the research and spent the next couple of years really trying to understand what they, the wholehearted, what the choices they were making, and what are we doing with vulnerability? Why do we struggle with it so much? Am I alone in struggling with vulnerability? No. So this is what I learned. We numb vulnerability. When we're waiting for the call, it was funny. I sent something out on Twitter and on Facebook that says, how would you define vulnerability? What makes you feel vulnerable? And within an hour and a half, I had 150 responses. Because I wanted to know, what's out there. Having to ask my husband for help because I'm sick and we're newly married. Initiating sex with my husband. Initiating sex with my wife. Being turned down. Asking someone out. Waiting for the doctor to call back, getting laid off, laying off people. This is the world we live in. We live in a vulnerable world. And one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. And I think there's evidence, and it's not the only reason this evidence exists, but I think that it's a huge cause. We are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in U.S. history. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff. Here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I don't want to feel these. And I know that's knowing laughter. I hack into your lives for a living. I know that's, God. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other affects or emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy. We numb gratitude. We numb happiness. And then we are miserable, and we are looking for purpose and meaning. And then we feel vulnerable, so then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle. One of the things that I think that we need to think about is why and how we numb. And it doesn't just have to be addiction. The other thing we do is we make everything that's uncertain, certain. Religion has gone from a belief in faith and mystery to certainty. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. That's it. Just certain. The more afraid we are, the more vulnerable we are, the more afraid we are. This is what politics looks like today. There's no discourse anymore. There's no conversation. There's just blame. You know how blame is described in the research? A way to discharge pain and discomfort. We perfect. If there's anyone who wants their life to look like this, it would be me. But it doesn't work. Because what we do is we take fat from our butts and put it in our cheeks. Which just, I hope in 100 years people will look back and go, wow. You know. And we perfect, most dangerously, our children. Let me tell you what we think about children. They're hardwired for struggle when they get here. When you hold those perfect little babies in your hand, our job is not to say, look at her, she's perfect. My job is just to keep her perfect, make sure she makes the tennis team by 5th grade and Yale by 7th grade. That's not our job. Our job is to look and say, you know what? You're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you are worthy of love and belonging. That's our job. Show me a generation of kids raised like that and we'll end the problems I think that we see today. We pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on people. We do that in our personal lives. We do that corporate, whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, a recall. We pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this is not our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry, we'll fix it. But there's another way, and I'll leave you with this. This is what I have found. To let ourselves be seen, deeply seen, vulnerably seen. To love with our whole hearts, even though there's no guarantee. And that's really hard, and I can tell you as a parent, that's excruciatingly difficult. To practice gratitude and joy in those moments of kind of terror when we're wondering, can I love you this much? Can I believe in this passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophizing what might happen, to say, I'm just so grateful. Because to feel this vulnerable means I'm alive. And the last, which I think is probably the most important, is to believe that we're enough. Because when we work from a place, I believe, that says, I'm enough, then we stop screaming and start listening. We're kinder and gentler to the people around us, and we're kinder and gentler to ourselves. That's all I have. Thank you.
Sharing. That's video on the Human Network. Cisco, welcome to the Human Network.
Finally, just a few brief thoughts related to some of what we've learned from the research thus far. It's really comfortable for us when we want to like something and want to think that something's a breakthrough drug or medicine. We want to think that it's got all the goodness, right, and none of the negative side effects associated with any sort of substance. And while the research is being conducted now, though young as it is, it's important to know that there are some things that we've learned from this research. Right? We know through neuro research that the human brain does not stop developing until about the age of 23. Right? So substance abuse delays and in some cases stops brain development in terms of an emotional response entirely. This is why you can work with individuals who are 25, 26 years old when confronted with a stressor in their lives, the death of a loved one, a conflict at work or within a relationship, severe stress. You'll see that individual begin to revert back to a behavior that looks like a 15 or 16-year-old. And this can be a direct cause of utilizing substances at a very young age. Cannabis has been the leading illicit drug prior to legalization, in the US for the past 40 years. And so several studies, including 2 large longitudinal studies, suggested that marijuana can cause functional impairment in cognitive abilities, but that the degree and or duration of the impairment depends on the age when a person began using it and how much and how long he or she used. In other words, what some of the research said was, those who begin to use cannabis before the age of 23, before the brain has really essentially developed wholly, may have severe and drastic implications for their cognitive development and function throughout their lifespan. And that individuals, and again, don't consider this as a green light to continue to or to go ahead and use, but at the age of 23 or older, individuals who had began using cannabis after their brains had fully developed may still experience um, ongoing cognitive delays, but maybe not necessarily to the same degree as those who started while the brain was still developing. Again, research is new, but something to consider. As individuals age, right, we lose neurons in the hippocampus, which decreases our ability to learn new information. And what we are seeing from the research is chronic THC exposure over extended periods of time with heavy usage may hasten age-related loss of hippocampal neurons. Okay, so something to consider here is, yeah, it may have short-term benefits as a substance to some of our ailments. It is not without long-term potential harm, right, to our development throughout our lifespan. So again, I want to say thank you. I want to apologize for this lesson running a little bit long today, but I felt like it was really important to discuss an issue that is relevant to our reality in today's world. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson. We will go ahead and begin on the next slide with closing out with our centering exercise. Okay, and let us go ahead and begin our final centering exercise to close out this lesson for today. Thank you all so much. You all are amazing. Appreciate every one of you. Want to say thank you for continuing to engage in the content. So let's go ahead as usual and make sure that our hands and feet are in a nice comfortable position, right? Let's take that nice deep breath and let's start to vent, right? Get rid of all of those worries, those concerns, those thoughts that are permeating our being right now. And let's just draw into God's presence for the next 2 minutes. Let's just enjoy and focus on the scripture verse from John. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. Right? Not as the world gives, do I give it to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled or afraid. And our focus word for today will be courage. Courage. So, how is God speaking the need for courage into your hearts, into your spirit today? What does it mean for you when Jesus says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled or afraid"? I mean, that is such powerful language, right? Imagine someone that we care about deeply, that we trust in, going to them with all of our worries and concerns and telling them everything that's on our heart, right? And knowing that their response is one, do not let your hearts be troubled or afraid, but also imagine they had every power available to them to relieve us, right? Of that trouble, of that worry, of that fear. And go ahead and give that then to God in this moment, right? Give that to him. He's saying, don't worry, I'm here. So let's go ahead and take that nice deep breath. Let's close our eyes and I will keep track of the time. Okay, go ahead and feel free to open up your eyes. Welcome back. I want to say thank you so much for participating in the lecture this week. Thank you so much for hanging in there the entire term. I want to say thank you genuinely, and I want to cheer you on. There I am in the corner, right, while you're in the ring, battling it out this semester. You've got this. You can do this, with my lucky sandwich shirt. So there I am. I want to say thank you so much for everything. Please check Blackboard for your assignments and due dates, so you have all that information. Know that I pray for you daily. You are in my prayers, you're in my thoughts, and feel free to reach out. I'm here if you need anything. Thank you all so much, and see you in the next lecture.